An old drunk blacksmith swings his hammer at cold iron and misses the anvil by 2 fingers. The whole street reeks of burnt quenching oil. And in the doorway stands a boy who just got thrown into this world out of a burning workshop and sees the worst forge of his life. He steps inside and says he needs work. But rewind a few hours. Rain hammers down on rusted iron like 1,000 tiny strikes. Yun Sihyeon opens his eyes to a gray sky behind a curtain of water. He lies on his back on something jagged. Metal. Mountains of it. Broken blades and bent horseshoes and twisted scraps of armor dig into his spine. He tries to rise and his arms fold under him. They are thin. Too thin. He stares at his hands. These are not his hands. His hands carried burn scars across both palms from 12 years at the forge. These hands are soft and pale and have never held a hammer. He is 18 again, maybe younger, soaked to the bone in a body he does not recognize on a heap of scrap behind a wall he has never seen. The wall climbs 40 feet of black stone. Beyond it rise towers and smoke and a distant sound that is not thunder. Blue light flashes across his sight. Words sear into his vision like a brand. System of craft. Rank F-. Subcategory Scrap Utilization. He blinks. The words stay. He blinks again. Still there. Floating at the edge of his right eye like a screen no one else can see. He has no idea what it means. He has no idea where he is. He has no idea whose body this is. The last thing he remembers is fire, his workshop in Seoul. 3 sleepless days finishing a commissioned tanto. The wiring in the back wall giving out. Flames eating the beams faster than he could move. And the hammer, his grandfather hammer, hanging above the quenching tank. He reached for it. The ceiling came down. Then nothing. Then rain on iron. Then this. A broken sword juts from the scrap beside his knee. The blade snaps off a third of the way from the tip. The guard is gone. Rust coats it so thick it looks more like a root than a weapon. Anyone alive would call it garbage. Sihyeon grabs it. His fingers move on their own. He turns the blade and runs his thumb down the flat. The blue light flickers and new words bloom. Carbon content 0.7%. Sulfur contamination along the spine. Quench temperature exceeded 800 degrees. Stress fracture from improper tang insertion. Crystalline structure partially salvageable. He understands every word. Not for magic, not from this system. He understands because he spent 12 years reading metal with his hands and his eyes and his ears. This sword did not break because it was weak. It broke because whoever forged it had no idea what he was doing. The steel itself is clean, cleaner than most stock he ever worked with back home. Someone took good iron and ruined it through pure ignorance. He almost laughs. He is dead. He sits in the rain on a garbage heap behind a wall in a world he does not know. And the first thing he feels is not fear. It is pity. Pity for a ruined blade. He tucks the sword under his arm and slides down the pile. His new body is clumsy and light. No muscle memory. No calluses on the feet. He slips twice and slices his palm open on a jagged plate of armor. The blood runs red. That is something. A narrow path hugs the wall toward a gap where the stone has crumbled. Past the gap crouch buildings, low and crooked and packed together like rotten teeth. Smoke climbs from a dozen chimneys. The smell hits him. Charcoal and sewage and wet dog and something sharper underneath. Something acidic. Quenching oil. Bad quenching oil. The kind that leaves scale on the steel and stinks for days. Someone nearby works metal. Badly. He follows the smell. The path winds between shacks of salvaged wood and torn canvas. Thin people drift through the mud with hollow faces and clothes mended too many times. Nobody looks at him. A boy his age hauling a broken sword draws no eyes here. He passes a woman ladling gray slop from a pot. He passes 2 children clawing over a bent nail. He passes an old man slumped in a doorway, staring at nothing, with eyes that quit a long time ago. The stench of bad oil sharpens. He rounds a corner and finds it, a workshop, if you can call it that. The roof sags in the middle. One wall is canvas. The forge is a cracked stone basin with a bellows stitched from animal hide. The anvil is a block of cast iron worn smooth and dished in the center from years of strikes in the wrong spot. And at the forge stands an old man with a hammer in one hand and a bottle in the other, short and wide and wrapped in a leather apron that is more patch than apron. His nose burns red. His eyes burn redder. He drinks long and then hits the metal on the anvil without looking. The ring comes back flat and dead. No resonance. He is cold, striking a piece that needs to glow cherry red. He misses the anvil face by 2 inches. The metal skids sideways. He swears and drinks again. This is the worst forge Sihyeon has ever seen, and he once watched a middle school metal class set fire to its own ceiling. The old man spots him in the doorway, looks him up and down, looks at the broken sword, snorts. He tells Sihyeon to get lost. This is a working forge, not a shelter for scrap rats. Sell the rust at the market because nobody here is buying. Sihyeon does not move. He is reading the anvil. Cast iron is wrong for forging. It swallows the impact instead of returning it. Every strike loses 30% of its force. He reads the forge. The basin bleeds heat from the cracked left side. The bellows valve leaks. The fire burns uneven because the coal is fouled with slag nobody bothered to pick out. He reads the tools. 3 hammers with loose heads, tongs with a sprung rivet, a chisel with a mushroomed head that will fire shrapnel into someone's eye within the week. He has never seen a forge this neglected, and he toured rural smithies in 6 countries. But under the ruin, he sees something else. The cast iron anvil has eaten thousands of strikes across decades. Someone who cared once worked here. The cracked basin still shows precise original stonework. The sprung tongs were hand-forged with a clean scroll and good proportions. Someone long before this drunk made this a real workshop. It has just been dying for a very long time. Sihyeon asks if he needs help. The old man laughs so hard he chokes on his drink. His last helper bolted 2 months ago after the Crafters Guild inspector warned him that employing anyone below D rank is a finable offense. He says Sihyeon looks F rank at best. No offense. Actually, yes offense, because F ranks are useless mouths. Sihyeon says he is F-. The old man goes quiet. Then he laughs harder. He did not even know F- existed. He says that is impressive in the wrong direction. Fine, sleep in the corner, pump the bellows for food, break anything, and he goes back on the scrap pile. His name is Pa. He never asks for Sihyeon's name. He clearly thinks it does not matter. That night, Sihyeon lies on a pile of coal sacks in the corner and stares at the ceiling. Rain drips through 3 separate holes. The broken sword rests beside him. The system window still glows faint at the edge of his eye. F-. Scrap utilization. He shuts his eyes and listens. Pak snores in the back room, loud for a man his size. Beneath the snoring, the building settles. Wood creaks, stone shifts, and faint under it all, the rain taps the scrap metal outside. It sounds like hammers on an anvil, dozens of tiny hammers all striking a beat apart. He has heard this before. Every night for 12 years in his workshop in Seoul. Rain on metal, the lullaby of a smith. His eyes go wet, and he tells himself it is the leak in the roof. He pulls the broken sword to his chest, like a child clutching a toy. The steel is cold, but it is steel, and tomorrow he turns it into something. He does not know what yet, but something. He drifts off with rust on his fingers and rain on iron in his ears. And for the first time since waking in this world, he is not afraid. He is thinking about carbon content and quench temperatures in the exact angle a 384-layer Damascus billet folds to pull the grain the old texts call flowing water. He is thinking about steel. He is home. Sihyeon woke before dawn. Pak was still snoring. The forge was cold and the rain had stopped, but the air was damp enough to leave a film of moisture on every metal surface in the shop. He lay still for a moment and listened to the building. Then he got up and went to work. He did not ask permission. He started with the coal. Pak's fuel supply was a pile of mixed charcoal and mineral coal dumped in a wooden bin with no lid. Half of it was slag. Quarter of it was rock. Sihyeon spent an hour sorting it by hand. He pulled out every piece of andite, every piece of ite. He separated the ite. He pulled out every stone and every chunk of ite. He sorted the charcoal from the mineral coal because they burned at different rates, and mixing them made temperature control impossible. He built 2 separate piles. Then he cleaned the forge basin. The crack on the left side was losing heat, so he mixed ash with clay from behind the building and packed it tight. It would not hold forever, but it would hold for weeks. He adjusted the bellows angle so the air hit the center of the fire instead of the left wall. He tightened the valve with a strip of leather cut from a ruined apron hanging on a nail. By the time Pak stumbled out of the back room, squinting at daylight, Sihyeon had the forge lit and burning evenly for what looked like the first time in years. Pak stared at the forge. He stared at the sorted coal. He stared at the packed crack. He asked what Sihyeon had done. Sihyeon said he fixed the airflow and cleaned the fuel. Pak opened his mouth and closed it. Then he opened his bottle and took a drink and said nothing. He sat on his stool and watched Sihyeon work with the expression of a man who has just found a dog reading a book. He did not say thank you, but he did not tell him to stop either. Sihyeon spent the rest of the morning examining every tool in the shop. The system helped. Each time he touched a piece of metal, the blue window flickered and showed him its composition and stress points. But the truth was, he did not need the system for most of it. He could feel a loose hammerhead by the vibration when he tapped it. He could see a hairline crack in a chisel by the way light reflected off the surface. He could hear the difference between good steel and bad steel by flicking it with his fingernail. The system confirmed what his hands already knew. That was important. That meant his skills had come with him. 12 years of training, thousands of hours at the anvil. The muscle memory of his old body was gone, but the knowledge in his head was intact. These thin, weak arms did not know how to swing a hammer yet, but they would learn. Arms always learned, if the mind already knew. Sihyeon picked up the Kindle and the system bloomed. Carbon content, 0.6%. Phosphorus contamination, moderate. Original forging temperature too high, causing grain growth. Partial decarburization on the surface. Salvageable core, approximately 70% of total mass. He turned it in his hands. Ugly. Rusted nearly through on one side. But the core was there. The metal wanted to be something. He could feel it. Then he looked around the shop. 3 rusty nails in a jar on the shelf. An old horseshoe hanging on a hook by the door. Scrap. Junk. He picked up the nails and the horseshoe and brought them to the anvil. The system read each one. The nails were high carbon. The horseshoe was medium carbon with good iron content and minimal slag. Together with the Kindle, he had enough material for something real. Not a repair, a rebuild. A complete deconstruction and reconstruction from raw material up. Something no one in this world would think to do with junk like this. He fired the forge hot, hotter than Pak had ever run it based on the coal consumption marks inside the basin. He let the fire stabilize, and then he put the Kindle in. While it heated, he broke the horseshoe into 3 pieces with the chisel and added them. The nails went in last. When everything was at bright orange, he pulled it with the tongs and began. First fold. Hammer the pieces together at welding heat. The metal screamed. Sparks flew. His arms burned with effort because this body had no endurance, and every swing of the hammer cost him twice what it should. But his aim was true. His timing was perfect. Years of practice guided each blow to the exact spot at the exact angle. He folded the billet, drew it out, folded again, drew it out, again. He lost count of time. The forge was a world, and the world outside it stopped existing. By evening, he had reached 96 layers, and his arms were shaking so badly he could barely hold the tongs. He ate a bowl of cold rice that Pak had left and went back to work. He worked through the night. He did not sleep. Every hour he folded the billet, and the layer count doubled. 96, 192, 384. At 384 layers, the billet was singing under the hammer. Not metaphorically. The metal rang at a higher pitch with each fold as the grain structure refined and homogenized. Sihyeon could hear the carbon distributing evenly through the layers. He could hear the phosphorus being trapped between folds where it could not cause brittleness. He could hear the steel becoming what it was always supposed to be. At dawn, he had a bar of 384-layer Damascus steel, the length of his forearm. It did not look like much, a gray bar with faint lines visible only if you knew where to look. But when he flicked it with his fingernail, it rang like a bell, clean and bright and sustaining for 3 full seconds. That was the sound of good steel. On the morning of the third day, he polished the blade with fine ash and a rag. The Damascus pattern emerged, 384 layers of light and dark steel woven together in a flowing pattern that the old masters called wood grain. It was beautiful. It was also functional. The edge was hard enough to cut hair. The spine was tough enough to flex without breaking. The balance point sat exactly where a Kindle's balance point should sit, 1/3 from the guard. He had no guard, so he wrapped the tang in cord stripped from a piece of rope and sealed it with heated pine resin. Simple. Effective. He set the finished Kindle on Pak's workbench and sat down on the floor because his legs would not hold him any longer. He had not slept in 2 days. His arms were trembling. His fingers were blistered in 6 places. The body of an 18-year-old boy who had never worked a forge was not built for this. But the Kindle was finished. Pak came back near noon, smelling like cheap wine. He saw the Kindle on his bench and stopped walking. He picked it up. He turned it in the light. The Damascus pattern caught the sun from the window and rippled like water. Pak held it up to his eye and looked down the edge. Straight. Perfect. He touched the edge with his thumb and pulled back immediately. A thin line of blood appeared. He set the Kindle down very carefully, as if it might bite him again. Then he looked at Sihyeon, sitting on the floor with blistered hands and hollow eyes. Pak did not take a drink. That was the most remarkable thing that happened that day. For approximately 30 seconds, the old man was completely and entirely sober. Before Pak could speak, the shop door opened. A young man walked in wearing a blue surcoat with a silver crest on the chest, a squire or servant of some noble house. He glanced around the shop with the expression of someone who had stepped in something unpleasant and was looking for a place to wipe his boot. Then he saw the Kindle on the workbench. He stopped. He picked it up without asking. He turned it. He tested the edge on his thumbnail. His expression changed. He offered 1 gold coin. Pak's eyes went wide. A gold coin was the price of a full-length sword from a B-rank forge. For a Kindle from Lower Hyun, it was absurd. Sihyeon said no. He said the blade was not for sale. The squire offered 2 gold. Sihyeon said no again. The squire looked annoyed. He asked why a scrap district smith would refuse 2 gold for a Kindle. Sihyeon said this was a rehearsal. He said the real one would be for someone who needed it. The squire left confused and irritated. Pak looked at Sihyeon as though he had grown a second head. He asked if Sihyeon was insane. 2 gold would feed them for 3 months. Sihyeon said he knew. He said the next blade would be worth more than gold. He did not explain what he meant. He was too tired to explain. Word spread. Not fast and not far, but enough. The squire talked. Squires always talked. Within 3 days of the Kindle incident, Pak's forge had its first visitor in months, then its second, then its 5th. Nobody came to buy, they came to look. A Damascus Kindle from a scrap forge in Lower Hyun was a rumor worth checking. Most of them left disappointed because Sihyeon had hidden the Kindle under his coal sacks and refused to show it. He was not interested in spectators. He was interested in work. And work meant understanding what he had. The system gave him something invaluable. Every piece of metal in the shop and on the scrap heaps within walking distance was now a labeled inventory. He spent 4 days walking the district. He touched every piece of junk he could find. Broken swords from the eastern battles, bent armor plates from decommissioned garrisons, nails and hinges and brackets and chains and horseshoes and cookpots and 100 other things that the people of Lower Heian used as currency and building material and children's toys. Every single one of them talked to him through the system. Carbon, iron, phosphorus, sulfur, manganese, trace elements, heat history, stress history. He was building a mental map of the best raw materials in the cheapest junkyard in the kingdom. On the 5th day she walked in. Sihyeon was at the anvil working on a set of tongs for himself because Pak's tongs were a hazard. He heard the door and looked up. A woman stood in the doorway. She was maybe mid-20s, tall, lean in the way of someone who had once been muscular and was now running on bone and anger. Her hair was cut short and uneven, as though she had done it herself with a knife. She wore a leather jerkin over a linen shirt, and both were patched and stained. A short sword hung on her left hip in a battered scabbard. Left hip. That registered immediately. She carried it on the left, which meant she drew with the left hand. He looked at her right side. The sleeve of the jerkin was pinned up at the elbow, empty below it. No forearm, no hand, just a clean fold of leather pinned with a brass tack. She looked at Sihyeon. She looked at the forge. She looked at Pak sleeping in the corner with his bottle. Her mouth tightened. She was not here to browse. There was a tension in her that Sihyeon recognized. Not anger exactly, purpose. The kind of purpose that runs on fumes because everything else has been burned away. She walked to the workbench and put something on it. A sword. Or what had been a sword. The blade was broken into 2 pieces. The guard was cracked. The grip was unwound and the tang beneath was bent. It was a straight, single-edged longsword in a style Sihyeon had not seen before. Military issue. The kind of weapon made by the thousands in a guild forge. But this one was different. The system read it the moment he looked at it. High carbon steel core with a low carbon iron jacket. Differential hardness. Someone had actually known what they were doing when they forged this blade. The original smith had been skilled. The steel was excellent. And it had been broken by force. Immense force. The kind of force that cracks stone. She said her name was Choi Da-hyun. She said this was her sword. She said it broke at the eastern fortress when the wall came down. She said she wanted it fixed. Her voice was flat, no emotion, just information. Fix this. That was all. Sihyeon picked up the 2 pieces of the blade and held them together. The break was clean through the midsection. A stress fracture that had been growing for months finally gave way under impact. The tang was bent from the same blow. The guard cracked because the peening was insufficient for the force transmitted through the blade. He could fix all of it, easily. Weld the break, straighten the tang, replace the guard. Any competent smith could do that much. But that was not what caught his attention. He was looking at the grip. The original grip was wound for a right hand. The wear patterns told the story. Thousands of hours of practice had worn grooves into the leather in the exact pattern of right-handed fingers. This sword had been made for her right hand, the hand she no longer had. He asked her how long she had been fighting left-handed. She stiffened. She said 2 years. He asked if any smith had rebalanced the sword for her left grip. She said no. She said she had asked 3 times. 2 smiths told her it was impossible to change the balance of a military blade without reforging the entire weapon. The 3rd told her she should find a different profession. She said this last part without inflection, but her remaining hand tightened on the edge of the workbench hard enough to whiten the knuckles. Sihyeon set the broken blade down. He told her to come back in 5 days. She asked how much. He said he did not know yet. She said she could not pay much. She worked as a market guard for 12 coppers a week. He said the price was not the issue. The issue was getting it right. She stared at him for a long moment, with eyes that were deciding whether to trust or to leave. Then she nodded once and walked out. Pak woke up somewhere in the middle of this and watched from his corner. He told Sihyeon he was an idiot. He said Choi Da-hyun was a disgraced knight with no money and no future, and fixing her sword was charity work. He said charity did not pay for coal. Sihyeon did not respond. He was already studying the broken blade. The system window was open and scrolling data faster than he could read. Carbon distribution, grain boundary map, Residual stress from the original quench. Microscopic delamination along the welded cord jacket interface. He was not seeing a broken sword. He was seeing a patient. And the diagnosis was not broken. The diagnosis was never fitted properly in the first place. Over the next 5 days, Sihyeon dismantled the sword completely. He separated the core from the jacket by careful heating and splitting along the original weld lines. He straightened the tang cold because the steel was good enough to take it. He reforged the guard from scratch using a horseshoe from his scrap collection. And then he did the thing that no smith in this world would think to do. He changed the geometry. A right-handed sword has specific balance characteristics: the edge alignment, the guard angle, the pommel weight, the grip diameter. All of it is designed around the assumption that the dominant hand is the right hand, and it sits below the guard with 4 fingers wrapped in a specific pattern. A left-handed sword is not a mirror image. It is a different weapon. The grip circumference changes because the left hand is rarely identical in size to the right. The guard must angle differently because the wrist rotation in left-handed cuts follows a different arc. The balance point shifts forward by roughly a centimeter because the left arm generates power from a slightly different shoulder position. Sihyeon knew all of this, not from magic, but from 20 commissions he had filled in Seoul for left-handed martial artists. He extended the tang by welding an inch of compatible steel from one of his sorted scrap pieces. He reshaped the guard to sit flush against a left wrist in a low guard position. He moved the balance point forward by thinning the last 2 inches of the blade near the tip. He reground the edge geometry from scratch. Not the standard V-grind that every military blade in this kingdom used, but a convex grind, more durable. Better for the percussive cutting style that a one-armed fighter would default to. Then, he made a new grip. He had no leather, so he used strips of linen soaked in pine resin and wound them tight. The winding pattern was for a left hand, specifically for Da-hyun's left hand. He had watched how she gripped the workbench. He had memorized the finger spacing, the pad width, the angle of her wrist at rest. The grip was made for one hand on this planet, and it was hers. He worked through the nights again. Pak stopped commenting after the second day. By the 4th day, the old man was bringing him food without being asked. On the 5th morning, Sihyeon polished the blade and etched it lightly with vinegar to bring out the grain pattern. The original Damascus core showed through beautifully, waves of light and dark steel flowing down the blade like water over stone. He set it on the workbench and waited. She came at noon. She walked in and stopped when she saw the sword. It was laying on a clean cloth, which was a piece of Sihyeon's shirt that he had washed in the rain barrel. He picked it up and held it out to her, handle first, angled toward her left hand. She took it. Her fingers closed around the grip and something changed in her face. Her eyes widened slightly, her jaw unclenched by a fraction. She lifted the blade. The balance was different. She could feel it. Every sword she had touched in 2 years had fought her. Too heavy on the right assumptions, too wide in the grip, wrong angle on the guard that bit into her wrist on every cut. This one did not fight. This one agreed. Da-hyun came back the next day. She did not say why. She sat on a crate near the door and watched Sihyeon work. She came back the day after that, and the day after that. On the 4th day, she stopped sitting and started helping. She carried coal, she pumped the bellows, she held pieces with the tongs when Sihyeon needed a second hand. She did not ask permission, and he did not offer explanation. It was simply understood. She owed him something she could not pay in copper, so she paid in presents. That was enough. The forge was changing. Sihyeon had spent his first week learning the limitations of this world's metallurgy, and they were staggering. The Crafters Guild controlled all official forges in the kingdom. Every smith above D rank was required to register with the guild. Every weapon sold above a certain quality threshold required a guild stamp. Every piece of star metal, the rarest and most valued material in the world, was allocated by the guild to its ranked members in strict order of their system rating. The entire economy of warfare ran through a single bottleneck, and that bottleneck was controlled by people who believed that a higher rank meant better steel. Sihyeon had spent enough time with the system to know that this was wrong. Rank determined how much magical energy a smith could channel into a weapon during forging. Higher rank meant more enchantment potential, more runic capacity, more divine reinforcement. That was real, and Sihyeon could not replicate it. He had no magical ability whatsoever. His F- system gave him sight and gave him permission to reshape metal, and that was all. But rank had nothing to do with metallurgy. A SSS rank smith could pour divine fire into a blade with the grain structure of cheese, and the result would be a magically powerful weapon that shattered on the third impact. Sihyeon had already seen 3 such weapons on the scrap heap outside the wall. Legendary blades, enchanted to glow and burn and cut through stone. All broken, all ruined by bad steel and worse heat treatment hidden beneath layers of magic. He explained this to Dahyun one evening while she pumped the bellows. He said magic in this world was paint on a house. If the house was built well, the paint protected it and made it beautiful. If the house was built badly, the paint just made the collapse look more impressive. Dahyun said that was the most insulting thing anyone had ever said about enchanted weaponry, and she wanted him to say it louder so the guild could hear. She almost smiled when she said it. Almost. Word of the reforged sword reached further than the Kindle had. Dahyun used it. She had no choice. She was still working as a market guard, and now she was working with a weapon that cut through wooden stalls when she misjudged a swing. Other guards noticed. A sergeant from the watch asked where she got it. She told the truth. A scrap district smith with an F- rating. The sergeant laughed. Then he saw her cut a practice post in half with one stroke, and stopped laughing. Within 2 weeks, Sihyeon had 3 commissions. A watch sergeant wanted his standard issue sword resharpened and rebalanced. A retired soldier wanted a knife that could actually hold an edge. A butcher from the upper market wanted a cleaver that did not chip on bone. Small work. Simple work. Sihyeon charged in copper what guildsmiths charged in silver, and he delivered in days what they delivered in weeks. Every blade that left his forge was better than its price suggested. Not by a little, by an absurd margin. The watch sergeant's sword came back sharper and lighter than the day it was issued, and the man had owned it for 9 years. The soldier's knife could shave hair. The butcher's cleaver went through a cow's femur without slowing down. None of these were masterpieces. Sihyeon considered them warm-ups. His hands were learning this new body. Each commission taught his muscles where they needed to build callus and where they needed to stretch. Each day at the anvil added a fraction of the strength he needed. He ate more than Pak thought possible for someone that thin. The body was rebuilding itself around the demands of the craft. But the work drew attention from the wrong direction. On a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the Kindle, a man walked into the forge wearing the black and silver uniform of the Crafters Guild Inspection Division. He was tall and thin and had the face of someone who enjoyed finding problems. He looked around the forge with undisguised contempt. He looked at Sihyeon. He asked for his guild registration. Sihyeon said he did not have one. The inspector said that forging and selling weapons without guild registration was a criminal offense punishable by confiscation of tools and imprisonment. Sihyeon said he was aware. The inspector asked who his master was. Pak stepped forward, looking more sober than usual, and said Sihyeon was his apprentice, working under his D-rank registration. The inspector said that Pak's registration was 3 months expired, and his inspection fees were 6 months overdue. He said the forge was in violation of 16 guild codes, including fire safety, ventilation, tool maintenance, and material sourcing documentation. He said he was shutting the forge down effective immediately. Dahyun was leaning against the wall near the door. Her hand rested on her sword. Not threateningly, just resting. But the inspector noticed and his eyes narrowed. He asked if she was threatening a guild officer. She said no. She said she was standing near a wall. He told her to move. She did not move. The temperature in the room changed. Sihyeon stepped between them. He told the inspector he would pay the overdue fees and submit for re-registration within the week. The inspector said the fees plus penalties came to 8 silver. 8 silver was more than Sihyeon had made in total since arriving in this world. Pak went pale. The inspector wrote something on a slate tablet and told them they had 7 days. Then he left. Pak sat down heavily on his stool. He said 8 silver was impossible. He said the forge was finished. He had been expecting this for months, but the reality of it still hit him like a hammer. Sihyeon looked at the slate tablet the inspector had left on the workbench. The numbers were clear. Registration renewal, back fees, penalties, inspection fine, material sourcing audit fee. Every line item was inflated by at least double what it should have been based on the rate chart posted in the market square. The guild was not just enforcing rules, they were squeezing. Sihyeon went to the scrap heap that afternoon. He spent 3 hours sorting through metal. When he came back, he had 14 pieces of various quality. Broken blades, bent fittings, a cracked helmet, nails. He laid them out on the workbench and the system cataloged each one. He calculated 14 pieces, combined mass roughly 6 kilograms of usable iron. If he folded and forged properly, he could make 3 Kindles and 1 short sword from this material. At the prices the market would bear in Lower Hyun, he could sell each Kindle for a silver and the short sword for 3. 6 silver. Not enough. He needed 2 more. Dahyun came by that evening. He told her about the 8 silver. She was quiet for a moment. Then she left and came back an hour later with a heavy sack. She upended it on the workbench. 17 broken arrowheads, 8 bent crossbow bolts, a handful of chain links, a dented shield boss. She said she had collected them from the practice yard behind the watch barracks. Nobody wanted them. Nobody counted them. They were garbage. Sihyeon picked up an arrowhead and the system read it. High carbon, clean iron, military grade. He looked at Dahyun. She was staring at the wall and her jaw was set in that way that meant she was bracing for rejection. He told her this was exactly what he needed. She blinked. He said the arrowheads were better steel than half the swords on the scrap heap. She looked at him as if he was speaking a foreign language. He was, the language of metallurgy. But she was starting to learn it. He worked for 5 days straight. Dahyun pumped the bellows in shifts. Pak sorted coal and kept the fire fed. The old man did not drink once during those 5 days, and when Sihyeon noticed, he did not comment. Because some things heal faster when nobody points at them. 3 kinjals, 1 short sword, 1 utility knife from the leftover material. The kinjals were 256-layer Damascus. The short sword was 512-layer, with a core of the arrowhead steel that rang like crystal when struck. The utility knife was simple but beautiful. Single steel, full flat grind, perfect for daily carry. Sihyeon sold them in the market. The kinjals went for 1 silver each. The short sword went for 3 silver to a caravan guard who tested the edge and immediately handed over the money without bargaining. The utility knife he gave to Pak. He said it was payment for the roof and the coal sacks. Pak held the knife in his hands and turned it over 3 times and then put it in his belt and did not say a word for the rest of the day. 6 silver, plus the 2 from the kinjal sales that week. 8 silver. Sihyeon walked into the guild office on the 7th day and put 8 silver coins on the counter. The clerk counted them twice. The registration was renewed. The forge was legal. When he walked back into the workshop, Dahyun was sitting on her crate by the door. She asked if they were done. He said they were starting. The morning after the guild payment, Sihyeon woke up and could not close his hands. The blisters had become calluses, and the calluses had cracked, and the cracks had bled in the night, and dried into stiff crusts that locked his fingers at odd angles. He sat on his coal sacks and stared at his hands. This body was not built for what he was doing to it. 5 days of continuous forging had pushed it past every limit. His shoulders ached. His lower back was a solid knot of pain from hip to rib. His right elbow had a sharp clicking sensation that meant he had strained a tendon. He was 18 years old in this body, and he felt 60. Dahyun found him like that. She did not ask if he was hurt. She could see. She took a bucket of water and a strip of clean linen from her pack and sat down next to him without a word. She soaked the crusts until they softened and then wrapped his hands 1 finger at a time. Her left hand worked with the precision of someone who had field-dressed wounds before. When she finished, she told him he was an idiot. She said burning himself out in a week would not save anyone. He said he knew. She said, then act like it. He did not argue. She was right, and they both knew it. But there was a problem she did not understand. Every blade he forged in this world sent a signal. Not a visible signal, not a sound, something deeper. He could feel it when the hammer struck true on a perfect weld, a vibration that went beyond the metal and beyond the anvil and into something he could not name. A resonance, like a bell ringing in a room too far away to see. He did not know who was listening, but someone was. Pak had changed. The 5 days without drinking had cracked something open in the old man. He was up before dawn now, sweeping the forge floor and sorting coal without being asked. He still talked too much and complained about everything, but his hands were steady and his eyes were clear. Sihyeon gave him a task. He asked Pak to teach him everything about local metals, not system knowledge, real knowledge, where the iron came from, which mines were still operating, what ores the Eastern territories had produced before the fortresses fell, what scrap carried what history. Pak turned out to be a fountain. He had been a D-rank smith for 30 years, and his hands had forgotten more than most apprentices ever learned. He knew which military contracts used Eastern ore versus Southern ore. He knew that the garrison swords from 15 years ago were better than anything the guild produced now because the old mines had natural manganese in the iron. He knew that the helmets from the Third Order were forged with a particular clay temper that made them ring differently from any other armor in the kingdom. All of this poured out of him like water from a cracked dam, and Sihyeon absorbed every drop. The 6th commission changed everything. A man came to the forge at dusk. He was not from Lower Hyun. His clothes were simple but well made. Linen shirt, wool coat, good boots. He had the build of a fighter, wide shoulders, thick forearms, scars on his knuckles. But his eyes were the giveaway. They moved constantly, checking exits, measuring distances, evaluating threats. He was trained. Not just trained, but seasoned. He said he had heard about a smith who made blades from scrap. He said he needed a sword. Not for decoration, not for status, for survival. Sihyeon asked him what he meant. The man sat down on Pak's stool and told him. His name was Sergeant Baek Jinho, former commander of a platoon in the 7th Infantry, stationed at the northern garrison until 4 months ago when the garrison fell to an Orden breach. His entire platoon was killed. All 42 of them. He survived because he was in the latrine when the wall came down, and by the time he climbed out of the rubble, the battle was over and everyone he knew was dead. He walked south for 3 weeks and arrived in Henson with nothing. The army listed him as killed in action. When he reported alive, they accused him of desertion. He was stripped of rank, court-martialed, sentenced to 5 years in the labor camps. He escaped during a prisoner transfer when the wagon broke an axle on the southern road. Now he was a fugitive, a dead man walking. And he needed a weapon because the things that killed his platoon were coming south, and the army was not going to stop them, and someone had to. Sihyeon listened to all of this without interrupting. When Baek was finished, he asked one question. He asked how Baek held a sword. Baek looked confused. Sihyeon explained. He said every fighter holds a weapon differently. Grip width, finger placement, wrist angle, dominant shoulder rotation. He said the sword he would make would be built for Baek's hands specifically. Not for a sergeant, not for an infantryman, for Baek Jinho. Baek stared at him for a long time. Then he held out his hands. Sihyeon examined them. Large hands, thick fingers, a healed fracture in the right ring finger that limited its range of motion. A deep scar across the left palm that had tightened the skin and reduced flexibility in the last 2 fingers. He looked at the callus patterns. Heavy wear on the base of the right index finger and the heel of the right palm. A power grip fighter, overhead style. Someone who relied on downward cuts and used his weight behind the blade. The fracture in the ring finger meant he compensated by squeezing harder with the middle finger. The scar on the left palm meant his offhand grip was weaker than it should be, and he probably avoided two-handed techniques because of the pain. Sihyeon said he would need 7 days. Baek asked the price. Sihyeon said one favor. When the sword was done, Baek would test it. Not in the shop, in the field, against the things that were coming. And he would come back and tell Sihyeon what broke and what held and where the balance was wrong. Beck said that was not a price. Sihyeon said it was the only price that mattered. A smith who never heard how his blades performed in battle was a smith forging in the dark. Beck nodded slowly. He said he would be back in 7 days. Then he left. Sihyeon started that night. He chose his materials carefully. The system guided him through the scrap inventory he had built over the past weeks. For the core, he selected 3 arrowheads from Dahyun's collection. High carbon, clean. For the jacket, he chose a section of garrison helmet that Pak identified as third order issue. Manganese rich, tough. For the edge, he reserved a piece of broken cavalry saber that had the highest carbon content he had found in any scrap in Lower Hyun. He built the billet in layers. Core of hard high-carbon steel for the spine. Jacket of tough medium carbon for the body. Edge of ultra-high carbon for the cutting face. 3 different steels in one blade. Differential composition. In his old world, they called it San Mai. 3 layers. Here, they did not call it anything because nobody did it. He forged slowly this time. He paced himself. Dahyun enforced it. She made him stop every 2 hours and drink water and eat whatever Pak had cooked, which was usually a gray porridge that tasted like sadness but contained actual nutrition. His hands were healing under the linen wraps. The calluses were thickening properly now. His arms were stronger than they had been a week ago, measurably stronger. This body was young, and it responded to work faster than his old body ever had. He could feel it adapting. The muscles in his forearms were beginning to remember movements he had not yet taught them, as though the 18-year-old boy whose body this had been was somewhere deep beneath, lending what little muscle memory he had to the cause. On the 3rd day, he shaped the blade. Straight, single edge, 28 inches, designed for overhead cuts with a forward balance that would add momentum to downward strikes. The grip was wide enough for Beck's large hands, with a slight oval cross-section that compensated for the stiff ring finger. The guard was angled forward to protect the left hand's weakened grip during 2-handed blocks. Every millimeter was a response to what Beck's hands had told him. On the 5th day, he hardened it. On the 6th, he tempered and ground the edge. On the 7th morning, he polished it and set it on the bench. Beck came at noon. He was punctual. Sihyeon liked that. The sergeant picked up the sword, and his hands closed around the grip, and something in his posture shifted. Sihyeon had seen it before, with Dahyun. That moment when a weapon stops being a tool and becomes an extension of the body. When the hand stops gripping and starts holding. Beck made 3 cuts in the air. The 3rd one was a full-power overhead strike that whistled. He looked at the blade. He looked at Sihyeon. He asked how Sihyeon knew about the ring finger. Sihyeon said the calluses told him. Beck was quiet for 10 seconds. Then he said he would be back. He said Sihyeon had his word. Then he walked out into the street with the sword on his hip and his shoulders straighter than they had been when he walked in. Dahyun watched from her crate. She said Sihyeon was collecting broken people. He said he was collecting broken weapons. She said those were the same thing in this city. He did not disagree. That evening, Pak produced a bottle from somewhere. Not the cheap stuff he usually drank, something amber and clear that smelled like honey and smoke. He poured 3 cups, one for himself, one for Sihyeon, one for Dahyun. He raised his cup and said something about the forge being alive again. He said it was the first time in 10 years. Sihyeon drank. It burned in a good way. Dahyun drank. She coughed and called it terrible and then held out her cup for more. The forge was warm. The coal glowed low and orange. Rain started again outside and hit the scrap heap with its 1,000 tiny hammers. For a few minutes, nobody said anything. They just sat in the warmth and drank and listened to the rain on iron. Sihyeon thought about Beck's sword in the field somewhere out in the dark. He thought about what it would meet. He thought about what was coming south. He drank his cup and poured another, and tried not to think about the fact that he was making weapons for a war he did not understand in a world he had not chosen to enter. But the fire was warm, and the metal was good, and the rain sounded like home. And for tonight, that was enough. Beck came back 9 days later. He walked into the forge at dawn with mud on his boots and blood on his coat that was not his own. He put the sword on the workbench and sat down on the floor and did not speak for a long time. Sihyeon let him be. He examined the blade. There were 3 new notches on the edge near the tip, a shallow scratch along the flat from something that had slid down the blade toward the guard, and a dark stain in the fuller that would not wipe clean. The system read the stain. Iron-based, organic compound, blood. But not human blood. The molecular structure was wrong. Too much sulfur, too much phosphorus. Something else entirely. Sihyeon looked at Beck. Beck said he found a scouting party of 4 Orden creatures 2 days north of the city wall. Small ones, the size of dogs but armored in a black chiton that turned standard-issue swords like paper. His blade went through. Not easily, not cleanly, but through. 3 of them died. The 4th ran. He said the balance was perfect. He said the grip was the best he had ever held. He said the edge needed to be harder near the tip because the chiton caught and dragged on the softer steel. Sihyeon nodded. This was exactly what he needed. Field data. Real performance against real enemies. He took the sword and told Beck he would rework the tip geometry and have it back in 2 days. Beck said he would wait. He lay down on the coal sacks and was asleep in 30 seconds. Dahyun covered him with a blanket she kept in the corner and said nothing. Sihyeon reworked the tip. He reground the last 4 inches with a steeper angle and differentially hardened just that section by quenching only the tip while keeping the rest of the blade wrapped in wet clay. The result was a blade that was flexible and tough for most of its length, but glass hard at the point of contact. When Beck woke, he tested the edge on a scrap piece of iron plate. The tip punched through without catching. He looked at Sihyeon with an expression that Sihyeon was beginning to recognize. It was the expression of someone who had stopped hoping and then been handed a reason to start again. Beck said he knew other soldiers, deserters, fugitives, men and women the army had listed as dead or disgraced. Some of them were hiding in the camps outside the wall, some in the forests north of the city. All of them still capable. All of them unarmed. Sihyeon asked how many. Beck said if he put out the word, he could gather 30 within a month, maybe more. Sihyeon said he could not arm 30. Not yet, not alone. But he could start. Beck stood up and extended his hand. Sihyeon shook it. The sergeant's grip was firm, and his eyes were steady. And for the first time since arriving in this world, Sihyeon felt the shape of something larger than a single blade forming in the dark. That same week, a girl tried to rob him. He was sorting scrap behind the forge in the alley when he heard a sound, a soft scraping, metal on stone. He turned and saw a thin figure crouched behind the rain barrel, small, maybe 15 or 16, dirty face, matted hair, clothes that were more whole than fabric. She had a handful of metal offcuts clutched to her chest, shavings and filings and bent nails that had fallen off his workbench during forging, worthless to anyone except someone desperate enough to sell scrap by weight. She froze when he saw her. Her eyes were wide and dark and calculating the distance to the alley exit. He did not move. He did not shout. He asked her name. She said nothing. He asked if she was hungry. Silence. He went inside and came back with a bowl of pox porridge and set it on the ground between them. She looked at the bowl. She looked at him. She grabbed the porridge and the metal scraps and ran. She came back the next day. Same time, same spot. He left scraps in a small pile near the rain barrel. Not obviously, not like charity, just carelessly placed as though he had dropped them. She took them. He left porridge next to the scraps. She took that too. On the 3rd day, she did not run. She sat behind the rain barrel and ate while he worked 5 feet away. On the 4th day, she spoke. Her name was Yumi Song. She was 17. Her father had been a blacksmith in the Eastern Territories, a real one. He died when the fortress fell 3 years ago. She and her younger brother had walked to Hansen with a column of refugees. They lived in Camp 6 outside the southern gate. Her brother was 12 and sick. and she needed coppers for medicine. She had no system. None. Blank. The temple assessors called her empty, and that word followed her everywhere like a brand. Without a system, she could not register for work. Without registration, she could not earn legal wages. Without wages, her brother would die. So she stole scrap metal and sold it to junk dealers for fractions of coppers, and tried not to think about what would happen when winter came. Sihyeon listened. When she finished, he asked her a question that confused her. He asked if she could hold a hammer. She said, of course she could hold a hammer. She said she was not useless. He said he did not think she was useless. He said he needed an apprentice. She stared at him. She said she had no system. He said a system was a crutch. He said she had hands and eyes and a father who had been a smith, and that was more than most apprentices started with. He said he would teach her the real craft. No divine shortcuts, no magical readings, just metal and fire and the knowledge of what to do with both. She said he was lying. Nobody took on apprentices without systems. He said he was not nobody. She looked at him for a long time. Then she asked if the porridge came with the job. He said yes. She said fine. Yumi moved into the forge the next day. She brought her brother Minjun, a small boy with a cough that rattled in his chest and eyes too old for 12. Sihyeon gave them the back corner where Pak used to store empty bottles. Pak grumbled but moved the bottles without real objection. He had grown used to the forge filling up with strays, and some part of him seemed to welcome it. Sihyeon started Yumi on basics. How to sort metal by sound. Tap it and listen. High ring means high carbon. Dull thud means low carbon or cast iron. She had good ears. Her father had taught her something before he died because she already knew how to hold tongs, and she already knew that you never reach across the anvil face. Small things. Foundation things. The kind of knowledge that separates someone who was raised near a forge from someone who wandered in off the street. Dahyun watched all of this from her crate. She said the forge was becoming an orphanage. Sihyeon said it was becoming a workshop. She said those were the same thing in Lower Hyun. She was smiling when she said it. That was new. Sihyeon noticed but did not comment because Dahyun's smiles were rare enough that pointing at them would scare them away. The forge now had 5 people. Sihyeon at the anvil, Pak at the fire, Dahyun at the door, Yumi at the bellows, Minjun in the corner wrapped in blankets, quietly carving a piece of wood with a small knife Sihyeon had given him. It was crowded. It was loud. It smelled like coal and sweat and Pak's terrible porridge. And it felt more like a forge than any place Sihyeon had worked since his grandfather's shop 40 years and 1 lifetime ago. In the evenings he taught, not just Yumi, all of them. He talked about steel, about what carbon does to iron at different temperatures, about why a blade flexes instead of breaking when the grain structure is right, about the difference between quenching in water and quenching in oil, and why salt changes everything. Pak listened with his mouth open and occasionally said things like, "So that is why the Eastern blades sang different." And Sihyeon would nod and say, "Yes, exactly, that is why." Dahyun listened quietly and asked sharp questions that proved she understood more than she let on. Yumi wrote nothing down, but forgot nothing. She had the memory of someone who had learned early that knowledge was the only thing no one could take from her. At night, when the others slept, Sihyeon sat by the dying forge and stared at the coals and thought about what was coming. Beck's report meant the Orda was closer than anyone in the capital wanted to admit. 4 creatures 2 days north, scouts, which meant the main force was not far behind, and the army's swords could not cut their armor. His could. That fact sat in his chest like a hot coal. He was one man, with 1 anvil in the worst forge in the worst district of a dying city, and he might be the only smith in the kingdom whose blades could kill what was coming. The woman who changed everything arrived on a rainy afternoon, wearing a plain gray cloak with the hood pulled low. She stepped into the forge and stood in the doorway without speaking and looked around with the careful attention of someone cataloging every detail. Dahyun noticed her first. She straightened on her crate and her hand moved to her sword, not because the woman was threatening, because the woman was careful. Careful people in Lower Hyun meant trouble. Sihyeon was at the anvil, working on a replacement hinge for a market stall. Simple work, paid 2 coppers. He looked up and saw a woman of medium height with dark eyes visible beneath the hood and hands that were clean and uncalloused. Not a worker, not a fighter, something else. She said she wanted to commission a piece. She said she had heard about a smith who worked with scrap. She said she wanted something that would not break. Sihyeon put down his hammer and asked what kind of piece. She hesitated. Then she said she did not know. She said everything she carried broke eventually. Sihyeon studied her. The cloak was plain, but the fabric was fine. The boots beneath the hem were new and well-fitted. She wore no jewelry visible, but her posture was perfect. Shoulders back, chin level. The posture of someone trained from childhood to carry themselves as though being watched. He asked her to sit. She sat on Pak's stool with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. He asked what she needed the piece for. She said, for holding things together. He asked what things. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, herself. He did not press further. He asked to see her hands. She removed her gloves. Her hands were small and fine-boned, with calluses only on the fingertips of her right hand. A writer. Someone who held a pen for hours at a time. The base of her right thumb had a deep indent from pressing against a desk edge. The inside of her left wrist had a faint scar that looked old and deliberate, and Sihyeon chose not to look at it longer than necessary. He asked what she carried in her hair. She looked surprised. Then she reached up and pulled back her hood. Her hair was black and long and pinned in a complex arrangement with 3 pins. 2 were silver, 1 was iron. The iron one was old and bent and did not match the others. She said it was her mother's. Sihyeon asked if he could see it. She handed it over. The system read it immediately. Wrought iron. Hand-forged. Very old. The carbon content was low, but the phosphorus pattern was distinctive. Banded. Layered. This iron had been smelted from river sand ore using a traditional method that had not been practiced in over a century. The pin itself was simple. A straight shaft with a decorative head shaped like a small flower. 5 petals. The craftsmanship was modest but honest. Someone had made this with care, if not with skill. Sihyeon turned it in his fingers and felt the history in it. Then he looked more carefully. There was something else. Beneath the surface oxidation, the system showed him a faint pattern in the iron. Not decoration, structure. The crystalline grain of the metal had been shaped by repeated heating and cooling over many years of being worn close to a human body. Body heat was not enough to change steel, but this was not steel. This was old iron with a high phosphorus content, and phosphorus-rich iron responds to sustained low heat by slowly rearranging its grain boundaries. Over decades, the pin had literally been shaped by the warmth of its owner's body. It was a material fingerprint, a ghost of the woman who wore it. He told the woman he would make her a hairpin. Not from her mother's pin, he would never destroy that. From other material, but in the same style, 5 petals. He asked her to leave the iron pin with him for 2 days so he could study the flower pattern. She hesitated. Leaving her mother's pin with a stranger in a slum forge was clearly not something she had planned on doing. But something in the way Sihyeon held it made her agree. She said she would return in 3 days. Then she pulled her hood up and left. Dahyun watched her go. She said that woman was not from Lower Hyun. Sihyeon said he knew. Dahyun said the boots alone cost more than the forge made in a month. Sihyeon said he knew that too. Dahyun asked if he knew who she was. He said no. Dahyun said she had a guess, but she hoped she was wrong. Sihyeon spent those 3 days on the hairpin. He could have made it in 1. The forging itself was simple. A thin rod of steel drawn to a point and headed with a decorative bloom. But he wanted it to be right. He chose his material from the scrap pile, a fragment of a broken sword that the system told him had come from the same Eastern iron tradition as the woman's mother's pin. Similar phosphorus content, similar grain character. When he worked it, the 2 metals would speak the same language. He forged the shaft thin and strong, not rigid, flexible. A hairpin needed to bend slightly when pushed through heavy hair and spring back without deforming. He tempered it in 3 stages to get the elasticity right. The flower head he shaped cold, 5 petals. He copied the pattern from the mother's pin, but he did not copy it exactly. He made each petal slightly different. One was thinner, one was curved more than the others. One had a tiny ridge along its spine. Imperfections, deliberate ones. Because the original pin had imperfections. Because nothing made by human hands was perfect, and that was what made it human. On the last detail, he paused. The original pin was made of iron, and iron rusts. Steel rusts less, but it still corrodes. The pin he was making would be worn in someone's hair every day, close to skin, exposed to sweat and rain and time. He needed to protect it. In Seoul, he would have used a thin coating of lacquer or wax. Here, he had neither. But he had something else. Beeswax from a candle stub pot kept on the windowsill. He melted the wax and dipped the pin twice and let it cool. A thin, invisible coating that would protect the steel for months and could be renewed by warming the pin over a flame. Simple, elegant, effective. The woman came back on the 3rd day. Same cloak, same hood, same posture that said royalty louder than any crown. Sihyeon handed her the hairpin. She took it and held it up to the light from the forge. The 5 petals caught the firelight, and the grain pattern of the Eastern iron showed through the polish like wood grain in fine furniture. She turned it slowly. She looked at the original pin lying on the workbench next to it. Then she looked at the new one again. She said they were not the same. Sihyeon said no. He said the new one was not meant to replace the old one. He said it was meant to stand beside it. She slid it into her hair next to the iron pin, and Sihyeon saw her fingers tremble for just a moment before steadying. She asked the price. He said a fair price for a hairpin was 4 coppers. She put a silver coin on the workbench. He said that was too much. She said it was not enough. She left. Dahyun came down from the crate and stood next to Sihyeon, and they both looked at the silver coin. Dahyun said she was certain now. She said that woman was Seungan, the princess regent, ruler of what remained of the kingdom. Sihyeon picked up the coin and turned it over. On one side was a crest he did not recognize. On the other was a face, a woman's face, the same face that had been standing in his forge 10 minutes ago. He put the coin down carefully. He said, "That explained the boots." Dahyun did not laugh. She said this was dangerous. She said the princess regent did not visit slum forges for hairpins. She said something else had brought her here, and they needed to find out what it was before it found them. Sihyeon looked at the mother's iron pin still lying on his workbench. He had forgotten to return it. Or she had forgotten to take it. Either way, it was still here. A piece of the princess regent lying on a scrap district workbench next to 3 rusty nails and a half-eaten bowl of porridge. He wrapped it in a clean cloth and put it in the safest place he could think of, under his coal sacks, next to the first Kindle he had ever forged in this world. 2 things that mattered too much to lose. The princess came back, not in 3 days, not in a week, 11 days later. On a night when the rain was heavy enough to empty the streets, she appeared at the forge door with her hood dripping and her mother's pin on her mind. Sihyeon handed it to her, wrapped in the same clean cloth. She took it and held it against her chest for a moment before tucking it into her cloak. Then she sat down on Pak's stool and did not leave. It was late. Pak was asleep. Yumi and Minjun were curled in their corner. Dahyun was out on a night shift guarding a warehouse. The forge was quiet, except for the coals settling and the rain drumming on the roof. Sihyeon was cleaning his tools. He did this every night, wiping down each hammer and tong and chisel with an oiled rag, checking for wear, tightening anything that had loosened during the day. The princess watched him work without speaking. After 20 minutes, she said she was tired. Not physically. She said she had not slept more than 4 hours a night in 2 years. She said the kingdom was dying, and she was the only one holding the bandage on the wound. And the bandage was soaked through, and she could feel the blood between her fingers. But she could not let go, because there was no one else. She said this in the same flat voice someone might use to describe the weather, as though exhaustion had burned the emotion out of the words and left only facts. Sihyeon did not stop cleaning his tools. He did not look at her. He had learned that some people could only speak the truth when they were not being watched. He said the tea was on the shelf if she wanted some. She made herself tea in a cracked cup and sat back down and drank it in silence. Then she told him why she had really come. The kingdom's armory was failing. The last major engagement with the Orda had destroyed the guild's primary forge complex in the eastern quarter. 60% of the military's weapon production capacity was gone. The remaining guild forges were producing at half rate because star metal shipments had stopped when the northern mines fell. The Crafters Guild had responded by raising prices and restricting output to only the highest-paying noble houses. The army's frontline soldiers were fighting with weapons that were chipped and cracked and held together with prayer. She had issued the Smith's Call 3 weeks ago, a desperate open summons for any capable smith to contribute weapons for the defense. The response had been almost nothing. The high-ranked smiths were either dead or had fled south to do Karn's territory, where the pay was better and the Orda was someone else's problem. The mid-ranked smiths were hoarding their materials. The low-ranked smiths did not have the skill. And then she had heard a rumor. A scrap district smith with an F- rating who forged Damascus steel from garbage. A smith whose blades cut through chitin that turned military-issue steel. A smith who made weapons for specific hands. She said she had not believed it. She said she came to see for herself. She said the hairpin had told her everything she needed to know. She asked Sihyeon if he could forge weapons for her army. Sihyeon stopped cleaning his tools. He put down the rag and looked at her for the first time since she had sat down. He said he could. He said the question was not whether he could, but how many and how fast. One man at one anvil could produce perhaps 2 combat-ready blades per week at the quality required to penetrate Orden chitin. 2 blades a week against an army of thousands was nothing. She asked what he needed. He said he needed everything. More forges, more fuel, more hands. Access to the scrap from every fallen garrison and every battlefield the army had abandoned. Most importantly, he needed time, and he needed the guild off his back. She was quiet. Then she said she could give him some of that. Not all. The guild was powerful, and she could not openly defy them without fracturing the few alliances holding the kingdom together. But she could give him a quiet dispensation. An unsigned order that would keep inspectors away from his forge. And she could give him access to the military scrapyards. Tons of broken weapons and armor from 3 years of losing battles. All of it classified as waste. All of it waiting to be melted down and sold for pennies. Sihyeon said there was one more thing. He said he needed to see the front. He needed to examine Orden chitin himself. He needed to understand what his blades were cutting through. Without that knowledge, he was forging blind. The princess looked at him steadily. She said, the front was death. He said, a forge without knowledge was also death, just slower. She said she would arrange it. Then she finished her tea and stood. At the door, she stopped. She said the hairpin was the first thing anyone had made for her since her father died. Not for the princess, not for the regent, for her. She said she wore it every day. Then she pulled her hood up and walked into the rain. The next morning, Sihyeon told the others. Not everything, not about the princess. He said he had a new commission, a large one, military work. He said he needed to expand the operation. Pak asked how large. Sihyeon said, as large as they could manage. Pak sat down slowly. Dahyun leaned forward on her crate. Yumi stopped sweeping and listened. Sihyeon laid it out. He needed at least 2 more forges. He needed coal in quantities they had never purchased before. He needed apprentices who could handle basic tasks. Heating, holding, grinding, polishing, assembly. The critical work he would still do himself. The folding, the welding, the hardening, the tempering. But everything else could be distributed. He looked at Pak and asked if the old man still remembered how to run a production forge. Pak's eyes were bright and clear, and he said he had run one for 15 years before the drink took him. He said he could run one again. Sihyeon looked at Yumi and asked if she was ready to learn faster. She nodded, no hesitation. Then he looked at Dahyun. He said he needed her for something different. He said he needed her to find Beck. He said the soldiers Beck knew were important not just as fighters, but as testers. Every blade that left the forge needed to be tested in real conditions against real enemies. Dahyun said she already knew where Beck was. She said he had been gathering people for 3 weeks in an abandoned mill north of the wall. She said there were already 19. Sihyeon asked how she knew. She said she was a former knight of the Third Order, and when soldiers gathered in the shadows, word traveled through channels that civilians never saw. He asked why she had not mentioned this before. She said he had not asked. That afternoon, a cart arrived at the forge. Military markings painted over with mud. No insignia, no name. The driver said nothing. He just unloaded 6 crates of broken weapons and drove away. Sihyeon opened the first crate and the system erupted. Dozens of readings flooding his vision. Carbon content, sulfur levels, fracture patterns, heat damage markers. Each piece a story of failure and violence. He picked up a broken longsword, and the system told him it had been quenched at 900 degrees by a smith who did not know the difference between bright cherry and orange. The blade had been brittle from the day it was forged. The knight who carried it had died because the steel was wrong. Sihyeon held the broken blade and felt a cold anger settle in his chest. Not at the knight, not at the Orda, at the smith who forged it, at the system that trained that smith, at the guild that stamped the blade as fit for service when anyone with hands and eyes should have known it would shatter on the first real impact. He set the blade down and started sorting. There was work to do. The expansion nearly killed him, not metaphorically. On the 8th day of continuous work, converting the back alley behind the forge into a second workstation, Sihyeon's body simply stopped. He was carrying an anvil stone he had traded 2 Kindles for from a mason in the upper district. The stone weighed 80 pounds. His arms gave out halfway across the yard, and the anvil dropped on his left foot, and he heard the crack before he felt the pain. 2 toes, the small ones, broken clean. He sat in the mud, holding his foot, and the pain was white and enormous, and he laughed because of all the ways to be crippled in this world of monsters and magic. He had done it to himself with a rock. Dahyun found him 20 minutes later. She did not panic. She splinted the toes with strips of wood and linen, while Sihyeon bit down on a leather strap and tried not to scream. She told him he was an idiot. This was becoming her standard greeting. She said a dead smith was worse than a slow smith. He said the math disagreed. She said the math could go to hell. She carried him inside the forge over his protests and set him on the coal sacks and told him he was not allowed to stand for 3 days. He lasted 6 hours. But the injury changed the timeline. He could not stand at the anvil properly with 2 broken toes. He could not work the bellows. He could not carry stock. For 3 weeks, he was reduced to sitting on a stool and directing others. This turned out to be the best thing that could have happened, because it forced him to teach. Yumi had been learning for a month now, and she was better than he had expected. She could identify carbon content by ear with about 70% accuracy. She could maintain a forge fire at consistent temperature by color. She could draw a bar to even thickness on the 4th try, where most apprentices needed 20. She was not a prodigy. She was something better. She was patient. She did not guess. She did not rush. She listened to the metal, and when she did not understand what it was telling her, she stopped and asked. Sihyeon taught her folding, not the full 384-layer Damascus. That required strength she did not yet have, but basic welding folds, 4 layers, 8, 16, enough to clean up dirty scrap and turn it into usable stock. She ruined her first 3 billets. The 4th held. On the 5th, she produced a small knife blade of 16 layers that was ugly and uneven, but structurally sound. Sihyeon examined it with the system. No delamination, no cold shuts, clean welds throughout. He told her it was acceptable. She smiled so wide that Pak laughed from across the room. Beck brought his people to the forge on the 2nd week of Sihyeon's recovery. Not all 19, 6, the ones he trusted most. They came at night through the gap in the wall that Sihyeon had entered on his first day. 3 men and 3 women, all former military, all listed as dead or disgraced. They ranged from a scout barely 20 years old to a grizzled sergeant in her 50s, with scars on her face that told a story Sihyeon did not ask about. Beck introduced them by name and rank and specialty: infantry, archer, shield bearer. 2 scouts, 1 combat medic. The medic was a woman named Liam Ashford. She was tall and thin, with light brown hair pulled back and the kind of calm that comes from having seen the worst thing and survived it. She wore the white vestment of a priestess of light under a travel-stained coat. A healer, a military healer who had served in the field hospitals at the northern garrison. She looked at Sihyeon's splinted foot and, without asking permission, knelt down and placed her hand on it. Warmth flowed through the broken bones. Not a full heal. The bones did not knit instantly, but the pain receded to a distant ache and the swelling reduced by half. Sihyeon looked at her. She said her system was healing rank B. She said it had limits. She could reduce pain and accelerate natural healing, but she could not replace what the body needed to do on its own. She said the toes would heal in 10 days instead of 6 weeks. He thanked her. She said thanks were unnecessary. She said she had spent 4 years healing soldiers who went back to fight with weapons that broke in their hands. She said if he was the smith who could change that, then keeping him on his feet was the most useful thing she had done in years. Sihyeon looked at the 6 soldiers standing in his cramped forge. They looked back at him. A thin 18-year-old boy sitting on a stool with a splinted foot in a workshop that smelled like coal and porridge. Not exactly the legendary armorer they had been hoping for. He told them he could not promise them great weapons. He said great weapons needed great materials, and he was working with garbage. But he could promise them weapons that would not break, weapons fitted to their hands, weapons that would cut what standard issue steel could not. He said in exchange he needed 2 things. He needed them to test every blade in the field and report back in detail. And he needed them to bring him materials. Every broken weapon, every scrap of armor, every bent nail and discarded horseshoe from every camp and ditch between here and the front lines. They needed to become his supply chain. Beck's sergeant, the scarred woman, asked why she should trust a boy with an F- rating over the Crafters Guild. Sihyeon reached under his coal sacks and pulled out the first Damascus Kindle, the one he had refused to sell for 2 gold. He handed it to her and told her to try to break it. She took it and looked at Beck. Beck nodded. She put the blade flat on the anvil and hit the spine with a hammer. Hard. The blade flexed and sprang back. She hit it again, harder. It flexed and returned. She hit it a 3rd time with everything she had, and the hammer bounced off and the Kindle hummed on the anvil like a tuning fork. She picked it up and examined the edge. Not a chip, not a scratch, not a mark. She handed it back and said she had seen enough. The group that would later be called the Written Off began that night. 6 soldiers, a crippled smith, a one-armed knight, a drunk old man, a teenage girl with no system, and a healer who had run out of people to save. They sat in the forge and ate Pax porridge, and nobody pretended it was a grand beginning. But Sihyeon looked around the room at the faces lit by the forge fire and thought about steel. About how you take broken things and fold them together and heat them and hammer them until the flaws become strength, until the cracks become patterns, until the weakness at the core is surrounded by so many layers of something harder that it does not matter anymore. That was Damascus. That was what he did. The Crafters Guild did not wait long. 3 weeks after the military scrap crates began arriving at the forge, a delegation appeared in Lower Hyun. Not an inspector this time. 3 men in the black and silver of the guild's enforcement division, flanked by 2 hired guards in plate armor. The lead enforcer was a young man with a thin face and the particular expression of someone who enjoyed authority over those who could not fight back. He carried a sealed scroll bearing the guild seal. He walked into the forge without knocking and without announcing himself, and stood in the center of the room and read the scroll aloud. The document stated that the forge operated by Master Pak Sun-woo of Lower Hyun was in violation of Guild Ordinance 7, Section 14, regarding unauthorized production of military-grade weapons. It stated that materials classified as military salvage were being received and processed without guild authorization. It stated that weapons produced in the forge exceeded the quality threshold permitted for a D rank registration. It stated that the penalty for these violations was immediate closure of the forge, confiscation of all tools and materials, arrest of the master smith and all apprentices for trial before the guild magistrate. Sihyeon stood at his workbench with a half-finished blade in front of him and listened to every word. Pak was white. Yumi had stopped breathing. Dahyun was by the door, and her hand was on her sword, and she was not pretending it was casual this time. The young enforcer rolled up the scroll and looked at Sihyeon. He did not look at Pak. He had been briefed. He knew who was really running this forge. He told Sihyeon he had 1 hour to surrender all tools and vacate the premises. Then he smiled. Sihyeon looked at the smile and read it the way he read metal. The microstructure of this man's expression said he had done this before, many times, and he enjoyed it. Sihyeon asked if the guild magistrate had reviewed the dispensation granted to this forge by the office of the regent. The enforcer's smile flickered. He asked what dispensation. Sihyeon said the forge was operating under a royal dispensation for emergency military production. The enforcer said no such dispensation had been filed with the guild. Sihyeon said the dispensation was filed with the regent's office and did not require guild approval. The enforcer said that guild ordinances superseded regent directives in matters of craft regulation. This was the moment Sihyeon understood the full shape of the problem. The guild was not just a trade organization. It was a power structure, and it believed itself above the crown. Dahyun spoke for the first time. She said that if the enforcer attempted to arrest anyone in this forge, she would consider it an unlawful seizure and respond accordingly. The enforcer looked at her. He saw the pinned sleeve, he saw the sword, he saw the look in her eyes. One of the hired guards shifted his weight and loosened his sword in its scabbard. The room balanced on a knife edge. Sihyeon stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He said he would not surrender his tools. He said he would not vacate his forge. He said if the guild wished to contest the regent's dispensation, they should take the matter to the regent's court, not to a scrap district workshop. He said if the enforcers attempted confiscation by force, they should know that the weapons in this forge were better than anything their guards were carrying, and the woman by the door knew how to use hers. The enforcer looked at Sihyeon for a long time. He was recalculating. He had expected a scared old drunk and a thin boy. He had not expected calm. He had not expected someone who talked about legal process instead of begging. He rolled up his scroll and said the guild would return with a formal writ from the magistrate. He said this was not over. Then he turned and walked out. The guards followed. The silence after they left was so thick, Sihyeon could hear his own heartbeat. Pak sat down on his stool and started to shake. Not from fear, from anger. He said the guild had taken his first forge 30 years ago. He said they had taken his best tools. He said they had taken his license and reduced him to D rank because he refused to pay a bribe to a senior inspector. He said he had spent 30 years drunk and broken because of those men. And now they were coming back to take the only good thing he had left. Sihyeon looked at the old man. He saw the trembling hands. He saw the red eyes. He saw the decades of rage compressed into a body that had tried to dissolve it in alcohol and failed. He walked to the workbench and picked up the utility knife he had given Pak weeks ago. He held it out. Pak took it. Sihyeon told him to hold it. Just hold it. Feel the balance. Feel the weight. Feel the edge. Pak held the knife, and after a moment, his hand stopped shaking. Not because the knife was magical, because the knife was proof. Proof that good work existed. Proof that the guild had not destroyed everything. Proof that Pak's forge still produced blades that mattered. The old man slid the knife back into his belt and stood up and went to the coal pile and began sorting without a word. That evening, Sihyeon sent Dahyun to find Baek. He needed the written off to accelerate their scrap collection. If the guild returned with a confiscation writ, he needed as much material processed and hidden as possible. Dahyun left at dusk. She returned at midnight with Baek and 4 others. They spent the night moving finished blades and raw materials to 3 different locations across Lower Hyun. A cellar under a condemned building, a space behind a tanner shop where the smell kept everyone away, a crate buried under the scrap heap where Sihyeon had first woken up. By dawn, the forge looked like a legitimate D-rank workshop. A few simple tools, some low-quality stock, nothing that would trigger a confiscation order. Everything of value was hidden. Sihyeon sat at his empty workbench and looked at the bare walls where his tools had hung. The forge felt cold without them, like a body without a heartbeat. Yumi sat next to him. She had been quiet all night, but her eyes were hard and dry. She said she had seen this before. When her father's forge was destroyed by the Orda's breach, she had watched everything burn and there was nothing she could do. She said this time was different. She said this time they could fight back. Sihyeon looked at her. She was 17 years old and she had no system and she had nothing in this world except a sick brother and a half-learned trade. And she was telling him they could fight the most powerful trade organization in the kingdom. He should have told her it was impossible. He should have explained the mathematics of power and the reality of their position. Instead, he nodded. He said she was right. He said they would fight back. Not with swords, with steel. Better steel. More of it. Faster. He said the guild's power rested on the belief that high rank meant better weapons. He said he was going to prove that belief wrong, so publicly and so undeniably that no writ from any magistrate would matter. Yumi asked how. He said he did not know yet. She said that was honest at least. The answer came from an unexpected direction. 3 days after the guild confrontation, a woman walked into the empty forge wearing a man's coat and smoking a long, thin pipe. She was tall and sharp-featured, with her hair cut close to her skull and eyes that moved like a pickpocket's. Quick, assessing, calculating value. She looked at the bare walls and the cold forge and the thin boy sitting on a stool, and she smiled the way a card player smiles when they see a hand they can win with. She said her name was Kang Yujin. She said she owned the scrap. Not some of it, all of it. Every junk dealer and metal salvager and scrapyard in Lower Hyun paid a cut to her operation. She said she had been watching Sihyeon for 2 months. She said he was the most interesting thing to happen to Lower Hyun in a decade, and the most dangerous. She said she was here to make a deal. Sihyeon studied her. The coat was expensive under the deliberate shabbiness. Her boots were reinforced at the toe and heel for kicking. The pipe was brass and old and well-maintained. A woman who valued her tools. He asked what kind of deal. She said she controlled the supply of every scrap metal in the district. She said without her cooperation, he could not source material at any useful scale. She said the guild had already contacted her people and offered to pay double for exclusive rights to all military salvage in the district. If she accepted that deal, Sihyeon's supply line would be cut overnight. He asked what she wanted instead. She said she wanted a partnership. 50% of everything his forge produced. Pricing, distribution, client relationships, all through her network. She said she would guarantee his supply, protect his shipments, keep the guild's agents out of Lower Hyun entirely because her people controlled the streets, and the guild's enforcers did not walk anywhere without her permission. Sihyeon said no. Yujin's smile did not change, but her eyes went flat. She asked if he understood what she was offering. He said he understood perfectly. He said he would not give anyone control over his work. Not the guild, not the crown, not her. He said he would buy her scrap at fair market price. He would forge what he chose. He would sell to whom he chose. If she wanted to do business with him, it would be as a supplier, not a partner. She said he was naive. He said he was a smith. She said that was the same thing. She stood and told him to think about it. She said the guild would come back in days, not weeks, and without her protection, he had nothing. Then she left, trailing pipe smoke behind her. Dahyun said Yujin was more dangerous than the guild. Sihyeon said she was probably right. Pak said Yujin's father had been a master smith, one of the best, A rank, before the guild stripped his license and seized his forge 20 years ago. The old man's name was Kang Taeho. Pak had known him. Everyone in the district had known him. He was a craftsman's craftsman, honest, principled, refused to cut corners on military contracts when the guild pushed for faster production at lower quality. They destroyed him for it, took his forge, took his tools, took his reputation. He died 3 years later in a debtor's cell. His daughter had been 15. Sihyeon listened to this and felt something shift in his understanding of Kang Yujin. She was not a criminal who happened to deal in metal. She was a smith's daughter who had built an empire from the ashes of her father's ruin. She hated the guild with the same fire that Pak carried. But where Pak had drowned his fire in drink, Yujin had channeled hers into power. Cold power. The kind that controlled supply lines and paid informants and moved through the district like water through cracks. 2 days later, Sihyeon did something impulsive. He went to Yujin's headquarters, a converted warehouse near the southern wall that served as the hub of her scrap operation. He brought one thing, a hammer. Not one of his forging hammers, a different one. He had found it in the bottom of a crate of military scrap, a cross-peen hammer with a cracked head and a handle that had been repaired twice. The system had read it, and what it showed him changed his approach entirely. The hammer was old, 30 years old, hand-forged with a distinctive pattern in the steel that marked it as the work of a specific tradition. The peen was shaped in a style Sihyeon recognized from the way Pak described the Eastern smiths. And in the grain of the metal, like a fingerprint frozen in iron, was the signature of its maker. Consistent, deliberate, unmistakable to anyone who could read steel. This hammer had been made by Kang Daeho. Yujin's guards stopped him at the door. He said he had something for their boss. They let him wait. Yujin came out after 10 minutes, still smoking her pipe. She looked annoyed. He held out the hammer. She looked at it. Her expression did not change. He said he knew whose hammer this was. He said the steel told him. She took the hammer and turned it in her hands, and for 5 seconds, her mask cracked. Not much, a tightening around the eyes, a slight tremor in the fingers holding the pipe. Then the mask was back. She asked what he wanted. He said he wanted to fix it. She said it was not broken. He said the head had a stress fracture running through the eye. One more hard strike and it would split. She looked at the hammer again. She had not known. She had kept it for 15 years as a relic, not as a tool. She had never used it. She had never had anyone examine it. Sihyeon said he could retemper the head and set the fracture and re-wedge it so it would last another 30 years. She asked why. He said because a good hammer should not sit on a shelf. She said her father would have liked him. She said that was not a compliment. She said her father liked everyone and it got him killed. Then she handed him the hammer and told him to bring it back in one piece. And she said the scrap was his at fair market price. No partnership, no percentage, just business. He said that was all he wanted. She said he was still naive, but she was almost smiling when she said it. He fixed the hammer in 2 days, retempered the head at low heat to relieve the stress fracture, reset the handle with a new wedge, polished the faces until the old forge marks showed through clean and sharp. When he brought it back, Yujin held it in both hands and swung it once into her palm. The ring was clear. She looked at Sihyeon. Then she looked away and said nothing for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was different, quieter. She said she would supply his scrap. She said she would keep the guild's street agents out of Lower Hyun. She said she would do this not for money and not for partnership, but because her father would have wanted her to help a real smith. Then she put the hammer on the wall behind her desk and told him to get out before she changed her mind. 6 weeks after the guild's first visit, the Tournament of Masters was announced, a biennial event held in the Grand Forge of Hansen, where the kingdom's finest smiths displayed their work before the court and the military command. Blades were judged on sharpness, durability, balance, enchantment power. The winner received the title of Royal Forge Master and a 10-year exclusive contract to supply the crown's elite guard. The tournament had been dominated by the Crafters Guild for 40 years. The current champion and 3-time winner was Grandmaster Hwan Do, SSS rank, head of the guild, a man whose legendary blades hung in the throne room and whose name was spoken with reverence by every smith in the kingdom. Sihyeon learned about the tournament from Pak. The old man mentioned it casually while sorting coal, as though it were weather. Sihyeon asked if anyone could enter. Pak laughed. He said, technically, yes. The tournament was open to any registered smith. In practice, no one below A rank had entered in 20 years. The entry fee alone was 2 gold. The materials for a tournament-grade blade cost 10 times that, and the judging panel was composed entirely of guild masters who would never award a title to an outsider. Sihyeon asked when it was. Pak said 6 weeks. Sihyeon said he was entering. The forge went quiet. Pak stopped sorting. Dahyun looked up from the blade she was oiling. Yumi paused at the bellows. Even Minjun in his corner stopped coughing and stared. Pak said it was suicide. He said Grandmaster Hwando's blades were forged from pure star metal with SSS rank divine reinforcement. He said the enchantments alone made them harder than anything natural steel could achieve. He said Sihyeon would be humiliated and the guild would use it as proof that F-rank smiths had no place in the profession. Sihyeon said he understood the risks. He said the tournament was public, attended by the court, attended by the military, attended by every smith in the kingdom. If his blade held against an SSS rank weapon in front of that audience, the guild's monopoly on quality would crack. Not break, crack. And cracks were where the light came in. Dahyun said that was either the bravest thing or the stupidest thing she had heard. She said she could not tell which. He said he could not either. The entry fee was a problem. 2 gold was more than the forge earned in a month. Yujin solved it. She appeared at the forge 2 days after Sihyeon announced his plan and put 2 gold coins on the workbench without ceremony. She said it was an investment. She said watching the guild's face when a scrap district smith walked into their tournament was worth 10 times the price. Sihyeon took the gold and registered the next morning. The clerk at the guild office looked at his registration form. F- rank. Forge address in Lower Hyun. The clerk asked if this was a joke. Sihyeon said no. The clerk stamped the form with the expression of someone processing a death certificate. He had 6 weeks to forge the best blade of his life. He chose his materials with obsessive care. From the military scrap, he selected 12 pieces, 7 sword fragments from different eras and different forges, 2 arrowhead bundles, a section of cavalry armor, a piece of gate hinge from the fallen northern garrison, and 1 piece that Pak identified with trembling hands, a fragment of the great anvil from the forge of Seungan, the oldest forge in the kingdom, destroyed in the First Orden breach 15 years ago. The fragment was small, the size of a fist, but the system read it, and what it showed made Sihyeon sit down. The iron was old, centuries old, smelted from ore that contained trace elements found nowhere else in the kingdom. Natural vanadium, natural tungsten, in quantities so small no system would flag them, but large enough to transform the properties of the steel when properly distributed. This single fragment was worth more than everything else in his inventory combined, not because of magic, because of chemistry. He built the billet over 12 days, folding and welding and folding again. Not 384 layers this time, 1024. He used every technique he knew, techniques from Seoul and Seki and Andong and places that did not exist in this world. He varied the carbon content between layers so the finished blade would have a visible pattern that was not just beautiful, but functional. Hard layers and soft layers alternating at the microscopic level, creating a material that was simultaneously rigid and flexible. An impossibility in single steel construction, a reality in Damascus. Yumi worked the bellows in 4-hour shifts. Pak managed the coal with a precision Sihyeon had not known the old man possessed. Dahyun kept watch. The guild had eyes everywhere, and a tournament entry from Lower Hyun would draw attention fast. On the 20th day, Emily arrived. Sihyeon had not expected her. She walked into the forge carrying a leather satchel and speaking before she was through the door. She was a young woman with red hair and freckles and an accent that marked her as foreign. She spoke fast and moved faster and knocked over a water bucket within 30 seconds of entering. She said she had heard about the tournament entry. She said she was an enchantress from Britholm, SS rank in runic inscription. She said the guild had rejected her application to practice in Hansen because she was foreign and female and her methods were unconventional. She said she had been looking for a smith who would let her work. She said everyone in the district told her to come here. Sihyeon looked at her. Then he looked at the blade taking shape on his workbench. A blade without magic. A blade of pure metallurgy. He had always known that his weapon's greatest limitation was the absence of enchantment. They were strong and sharp and flexible, but they had no magical reinforcement. Against the enchanted blades of the guildmasters, that gap was the difference between a good sword and a legendary one. He asked Amelie what she could do. She opened her satchel and pulled out a set of inscribing tools. Needles and styli made from materials Sihyeon did not recognize. She said she could inscribe runic patterns into metal that channeled ambient magical energy into the blade's structure. Not divine power, not system-granted enchantment, raw environmental magic shaped by geometric precision. Her method was different from the guild's. The guild stamped runes using templates and flooded them with system power. Amelie carved them by hand. Each rune was unique. Each pattern was designed for the specific piece of metal it was inscribed on. She said the guild called her methods primitive. She said primitive was another word for original. Sihyeon said he had a blade without magic, and she had magic without a blade. He said he wanted to see what happened when they combined. She grinned, and the grin was so wide it nearly split her face. She said she thought he would never ask. They worked together for 3 weeks. Sihyeon forged. Amelie studied the blade's grain structure and designed runic patterns that followed the natural flow of the Damascus layers. She said metal had channels, like rivers in stone. The layers he created during folding were not just physical boundaries. They were paths along which energy could flow. If she inscribed her runes along those paths, the magic would reinforce the steel's natural structure instead of fighting it. Sihyeon understood immediately. She was describing what he had always known about Damascus. The layers were not decoration, they were architecture. And now, that architecture had a purpose beyond metallurgy. The blade that emerged was unlike anything either of them had made alone. 1,024 layers of folded steel with runic inscriptions invisible to the naked eye running along every layer boundary. When Amelie activated the runes for the first time, the blade hummed. Not a metallic ring, something deeper. A vibration that Sihyeon felt in his teeth and his bones, and in a place behind his sternum that he had no name for. The Damascus pattern glowed faintly, not with fire, with something colder and older. The blade was alive. Not sentient, but alive the way a river is alive, moving, flowing, carrying force along channels that were both physical and magical. He held it, and for the first time since arriving in this world, he felt the full weight of what he could become. Not a scrap district smith, not a curiosity, a bridge between two kinds of knowledge that this world had never thought to connect. The Tournament of Masters was held in the Grand Forge, a cavernous stone hall in the center of Henson with a vaulted ceiling blackened by centuries of smoke. 20 forges lined the walls. Galleries rose on 3 sides filled with spectators. The court occupied the highest gallery, military commanders in dress armor, noble houses in silk and silver, and at the center of the royal box, the princess regent in a white gown with 2 hairpins holding her hair. 1 iron, 1 steel. Sihyeon saw them from across the hall, and something tightened in his chest. 14 smiths had entered. 13 were guild members ranging from A to SSS rank. Sihyeon was the 14th. When his name and rank were announced by the herald, a murmur went through the crowd. Then laughter. F-, scrap utilization. The words echoed off the stone walls and came back sounding even worse. Pak stood in the crowd near the floor with his arms crossed and his jaw set. Dahyun was beside him, with her hand on her sword. Yumi was at the back, clutching a rag she had been using to polish the blade that morning. Beck and 4 of the written off were positioned at the exits, not because they expected trouble, because they always expected trouble. The format was simple. Each smith presented a single blade. The judges tested it for sharpness against standardized materials, for durability against repeated impact, for balance through a series of weighted measurements, and for enchantment power through a runic resonance crystal that measured magical output. The smith with the highest combined score won. Sihyeon watched the first 12 presentations with careful attention. The blades were impressive, gleaming steel infused with visible enchantments that made the metal glow and hum. Each smith presented their work with rehearsed formality. The judges tested and scored, and the numbers climbed. A-rank blades scored in the 70s. S-rank blades in the 80s. An S-rank blade from a guild veteran scored 91. Then Grandmaster Hwando stepped forward. He was old, 70 at least, white-haired with a straight back and hands that were spotted with age but steady as stone. He carried his blade in a wooden case lined with white silk. When he opened it, the hall went quiet. The sword was beautiful. 3 feet of star metal polished to a mirror finish. Runes blazed along the fuller in gold and silver script. The enchantment was visible to the naked eye, a shimmering field of force that surrounded the blade like heat rising from summer stone. The judges tested it. Sharpness. The blade cut through the test block like it was not there. Durability. They struck it against an iron anvil face 10 times and it did not mark. Balance. Perfect to the milligram. Enchantment. The resonance crystal blazed white. Score. 97. The crowd erupted. 3-time champion, the greatest living smith. Hwando returned to his place with the calm of a man who had never doubted the outcome. Sihyeon stepped forward. The hall went quiet again, but this time, the quiet had a different texture. Anticipation mixed with ridicule. He carried his blade wrapped in a piece of linen that had once been his shirt. He set it on the presentation table and unwrapped it. The sword was not beautiful. Not in the way the guild blades were beautiful. It did not glow, it did not shimmer. It was dark steel with a visible Damascus pattern that rippled across the flat like water in moonlight. The handle was wrapped in cord. The guard was plain. It looked like what it was. A weapon forged from scrap by a man who cared more about function than display. The judges tested sharpness first. The blade cut through the standardized block cleanly, not as dramatically as the star metal blades, but completely. Score, 89. High, but not exceptional. Durability. The judge struck the blade against the iron anvil. Once. Twice. 5 times. 10 times. The hall was counting. 20 times. 30. At 30 strikes, the blade showed no damage, no chips, no bends, no marks. The judge stopped at 40 because the testing protocol only required 10. He looked at the blade and then at Sihyeon, and there was something new in his eyes. Score, 99. A murmur swept through the galleries. Balance. The judges measured. The numbers were not perfect. Sihyeon had designed the blade for combat, not for measurement. The balance point sat forward of the traditional ideal by ½ an inch. Deliberate. A fighter's weapon. But the judges scored by standard metrics. Score, 82. Enchantment. The resonance crystal flickered. Emily's runes were subtle. They did not blaze. They did not shout. They hummed along the grain lines of the Damascus, and the crystal read their output as moderate. Score, 78. Total, 348, against Hwando's 362. Sihyeon had lost, by 14 points. The crowd exhaled. The expected order held. The guild's dominance was confirmed. But Sihyeon was not finished. The tournament had one additional event, the blade duel. Any entrant could challenge any other to a direct test, blade against blade, edge against edge, until one broke. It had not been invoked in 12 years because nobody challenged the Grandmaster, and everyone else considered it beneath their dignity. Sihyeon raised his hand and named Hwando. The hall went silent. Hwando looked across the floor at the thin young man holding a dark sword wrapped in cord, and his expression was unreadable. Then he nodded. He drew his star metal blade and walked to the center of the hall. They faced each other across 10 feet of stone floor. The rules were simple. Lock edges, press. The blade that broke, lost. No combat, no technique, just steel against steel. Sihyeon raised his sword. Hwando raised his. They stepped forward and the edges met. The sound was extraordinary. Not a clang, not a ring, a harmonic. Two different kinds of steel singing against each other at frequencies that made the air vibrate. Hwando pressed. S, s, s. Rank power flowed through his arms and into his blade. The star metal blazed with enchantment. Divine force hammered against the Damascus edge. Sihyeon pressed back. He had no divine force. He had no system power. He had 1,024 layers of folded steel with runic channels that distributed every ounce of incoming force along the full length of the blade. He was not resisting Hwando's power. He was absorbing it, spreading it, the way a bridge spreads weight across its span. They stood locked for 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes. Sweat ran down Sihyeon's face. His arms were shaking. This body was not strong enough for this, but the blade held. At 2 minutes and 14 seconds, a sound cut through the harmonic. A crack, sharp and final. Hwando's star metal blade fractured 6 inches from the tip. A clean break along a grain boundary that the system showed Sihyeon in perfect detail. The star metal was pure. Too pure. A single crystal structure with no grain variation, no flexibility, no capacity to absorb force along multiple paths. It was the hardest blade in the room. And hardness without flexibility was brittleness by another name. The hall was silent. The top 6 inches of the Grandmaster's legendary sword lay on the stone floor between them. Hwando looked at the broken blade in his hands. He looked at Sihyeon's sword, which bore a single bright scratch on its edge and nothing more. The old man's face moved through several expressions in rapid succession: disbelief, analysis, understanding, and something that might have been the beginning of awe. He went to his knees, not in defeat, in recognition. He said 2 words that Sihyeon would remember for the rest of his life. He asked Sihyeon to teach him. Sihyeon lowered his sword. He looked at the broken star metal on the ground. Then he knelt and picked up the pieces. He held them out to Hwando. He said they should start by reforging this one. The old man took the broken pieces of his own legend, and for the first time in Sihyeon's experience of this world, an SSS rank master looked at an F-smith with respect. The aftermath of the tournament cracked the kingdom open. Within a day, the story had spread beyond the Grand Forge and beyond the walls of Hansan and into the camps and garrisons and refugee settlements, where people had stopped believing that anything could change. An F-smith broke the Grand Master's blade. The sentence moved through the kingdom like fire through dry grass. The guild issued a formal statement calling the result an anomaly and questioning the legality of the blade duel format. It did not matter. Everyone had seen. Everyone knew. The old order had a fracture running through it now, and Sihyeon's name was on both sides of the crack. 3 things happened in the week after the tournament. First, Hwando came to the forge. Not to the Grand Forge, not to a guild workshop, to Lower Hyun, to Pak's cramped, sagging building that smelled like coal and porridge. The Grandmaster arrived at dawn with the broken pieces of his blade in a silk case and a look on his face like a man walking into a temple of a faith he had just converted to. Pak nearly dropped his cup when he saw who was standing in the doorway. Yumi stared. Taehyun's hand went to her sword by reflex. Hwando ignored all of them. He walked to Sihyeon's workbench and set down the silk case and said he was ready to learn. Sihyeon opened the case and touched the star metal fragments, and the system showed him everything. And what it showed was tragic. The metal was extraordinary, pure, dense, resonant with a crystalline structure that channeled magical energy like copper conducts electricity. But it was forged as a single homogeneous mass, no layers, no variation, no internal architecture. Like building a castle from a single block of marble. Impressive until something hit it wrong. Sihyeon told Hwando the truth. He said the star metal was the finest base material he had ever touched. He said the enchantment work was masterful. He said the problem was not talent or power or rank. The problem was philosophy. The guild believed that purity equaled strength, that the fewer impurities and the more uniform the structure, the better the blade. Sihyeon said they were wrong. He said strength came from diversity, from layers that disagreed with each other at the molecular level, but were bound together so tightly that the disagreement became resilience. He said a forest survived storms not because every tree was identical, but because the different trees supported each other. Hwando listened to this with his eyes closed. When Sihyeon finished, the old man opened his eyes and said he had spent 60 years believing one thing, and in 2 minutes, a boy from a scrap heap had shown him it was incomplete. He did not say wrong. He said incomplete. Sihyeon respected that distinction. It was the distinction of a true craftsman. Second, Princess Halon summoned Sihyeon to the palace. Not through a messenger. She came herself. At night, in the gray cloak, with her 2 hairpins. She stood in the forge doorway and said the military command wanted to meet him. She said the tournament had done what she had hoped it would. The generals had seen. The commanders had seen. The frontline officers who had lost soldiers to broken weapons had seen. She said the Smith's Call was being reissued with Sihyeon's name on it, not as a participant, as the lead. She was offering him control of the kingdom's weapon production. He said no. She blinked. He said he would not take control. He said control was what the guild had, and control was what had broken the system. He said he wanted something different. He wanted permission to build a school, a place where anyone, regardless of rank, could learn the craft of steel, where F rank and SSS rank worked side by side, where the knowledge was shared and not hoarded. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said she would grant it. She said there was a place, the fallen fortress of Seungan, abandoned for 2 years, its forges cold and its walls crumbling. But the foundations were sound and the stone was good, and it was large enough for what he was describing. He said Seungan was perfect. She said she knew. She said she had been thinking about it since the night she drank tea in his forge. Third, Duke Karn moved. Intelligence reached Henson through Beck's network that the Southern Duke had assembled an army of 15,000 and was marching north. Not to fight the Orda, to take the capital while the kingdom's forces were stretched thin at the front. And his soldiers carried weapons stamped with a forging pattern that Sihyeon recognized from stolen reports. Copies. Crude copies of his Damascus technique. Someone had captured or bought one of his blades and reverse-engineered it. Badly. The copies had the visual pattern, but not the metallurgical structure. They were decorative fakes, layered for appearance with no attention to carbon distribution or heat treatment. They would look impressive and shatter on the first real impact. But 15,000 of them in the hands of an army marching on a weakened city was a threat that metallurgical critique would not solve. Sihyeon gathered everyone. The forge was too small, so they met in Yujin's warehouse. Pak, Taehyun, Yumi, Emily, Beck, and the written-off now numbering 31. Liam Ashford, Yujin and her lieutenants, Hwando, who sat in the corner and listened with the intensity of a student at his first lecture, and the Princess Regent, who stood by the wall in her gray cloak and said nothing. Sihyeon laid out the situation. Karn's army was 3 weeks away. The kingdom's military could not fight on 2 fronts. The Orda was pressing from the north. Karn was coming from the south. The only defensible position between Karn and the capital was Seungan. If they could hold the fortress long enough for the military to redeploy from the northern front, the capital would survive. If they could not, Hansen would fall, and the kingdom with it. He said the written off would hold Seungan, 200 soldiers by Baek's latest count, against 15,000. The math was suicide. Unless the 200 had weapons that the 15,000 did not. Sihyeon said he would arm them, every single one. Blades fitted to their hands, forged from the mountain of scrap that 3 months of collection had stockpiled. He said he needed 2 weeks. Da-hyun said 2 weeks to forge 200 weapons was impossible. He said it was impossible alone. He looked at Yumi. He looked at Pak. He looked at Hwando. He said it was not impossible together. Hwando stood. He said his guild apprentices had abandoned him after the tournament. He said the ones worth keeping had not. He said he could bring 12 smiths to Seungan within 3 days. Sihyeon said 12 smiths and his 3 apprentices and himself made 16 forges running day and night for 2 weeks. That was 448 forge days. 200 blades in 448 forge days was just over 2 days per blade. Tight. Brutal. But possible if the prep work started now. The forge at Seungan burned for 14 days without stopping. 16 anvils rang from dawn through midnight and from midnight back to dawn. Sihyeon set up the operation like a production line. Yumi and 2 of Hwando's youngest apprentices prepared stock, sorting, cutting, bundling billets for folding. Pak and 4 mid-rank smiths ran the folding forges. Not full Damascus, not 1,024 layers. That would take too long. 256 layers, enough to give the blades flexibility and edge retention far beyond anything standard issue. Hwando and 3 of his senior smiths handled the shaping. Sihyeon supervised the hardening and tempering personally because that was where blades lived or died, and he trusted no one else's eyes. Emily moved between forges with her inscribing tools, carving runic channels into each blade as it cooled. She had developed a simplified pattern that took hours instead of days. Less powerful than the tournament blade, but enough to reinforce the steel's natural structure. Liam ran the medical station because smiths working 20-hour days burned and cut and collapsed, and someone needed to keep them upright. Da-hyun organized the written off. Baek had gathered 212 soldiers by the time the fortress was operational. Former infantry, former knights, former archers, former scouts, former prison inmates who had been soldiers before they were criminals. She drilled them in the courtyard while the forges roared beneath the walls. She ran formations with practice weapons until real ones were ready. She was brutal and patient and exact, and the soldiers responded to her the way iron responds to a good smith. They became something under her hand. Sihyeon forged. He forged until his hands cracked and bled, and Liam healed them, and he forged again. He forged until his vision blurred, and Yumi made him eat, and he forged again. He fitted each blade personally. Every soldier came to his station. He looked at their hands. He asked how they fought. He asked about old wounds. He measured grip width and wrist angle and shoulder rotation by eye and by touch. Each blade left his station shaped for one person. Not a perfect custom weapon. There was no time for perfection, but the balance point was adjusted. The grip circumference was set. The edge geometry matched the fighting style. Good enough to feel right in the hand. Good enough to give a tired, beaten soldier the sense that someone had thought about them specifically. On the 10th day, the first scouts from Karn's army appeared on the southern road. Baek sent a patrol to intercept. They came back with 3 prisoners and the intelligence that the main force was 5 days out. 15,000 foot soldiers, 2,000 cavalry, siege equipment, and a personal guard of 400 elite warriors carrying the only real weapons in Karn's army. Everything else was the fake Damascus. Sihyeon examined a captured fake blade, and the system confirmed what he suspected. Decorative layering over a soft iron core. The pattern looked right. The steel was garbage. One hard impact against properly forged steel, and the fake would fold like paper. He showed this to Baek and Da-hyun. They nodded. The numbers were still suicidal, but the quality gap was everything. On the 13th day, Yujin arrived with 6 wagons of supplies, food, coal, medical stores, and something else. 3 crates marked with her personal seal. Inside each crate were bundles of crossbow bolts, forged in Lower Hyun by her own people using techniques Sihyeon had taught her. Not Damascus, simple high-carbon steel, properly heat-treated and properly ground. 200 bolts per crate, 600 total. She said a gift from the Scrap Queen. Sihyeon said he did not know her people could forge. She said there were things about Kang Yujin that the Scrap District Smith had not bothered to learn. She almost smiled. He almost smiled back. On the 14th day, the last blade left Sihyeon Station. 208 swords, 12 short swords, 6 kinjals for the scouts. Every one folded, every one tempered, every one inscribed, every one fitted. Sihyeon put down his hammer and could not stand. His legs gave out, and he sat on the floor of the forge and looked at his hands. The blisters had become calluses, and the calluses had become something harder. The hands of this 18-year-old body had been remade. They were a smith's hands now, scarred and strong and sure. Liam knelt beside him and healed what she could. The bone-deep exhaustion she could not touch. He thanked her. She said to thank her after the battle. She said there would be plenty of work for both of them. Karn's army arrived on the morning of the 15th day. They filled the southern valley from ridge to ridge. 15,000 soldiers in ordered ranks with banners flying and drums beating. The fortress of Seungan sat on a hill above the valley, with its crumbling walls and its cold towers and its 200 defenders standing on the battlements. The forges below still glowed. Sihyeon stood in the main forge with his apron on and his hammer in his hand. Not on the walls, not in the command post, in the forge, because that was where he belonged. Dahyun held the gate with her reforged sword in her left hand and 60 soldiers behind her. Baek held the eastern wall. Yujin commanded the crossbow positions with her father's hammer hanging from her belt, because she said it was lucky and she did not believe in luck. Emily stood at the central tower, inscribing defensive runes into the stone itself. Hwando was at the secondary forge because blades would break today and someone needed to repair them. The princess was not supposed to be here. She was supposed to be in Hansen, behind walls and guards and protocol. She stood on the northern battlement with a bow and a quiver and 2 hairpins in her hair, and Sihyeon saw her from the forge window and felt something break open in his chest that he did not have time to name. The battle lasted 18 hours. Karn's army hit the walls at dawn and did not stop. The fake Damascus blades shattered against Seungan's stone within the first hour. Karn's soldiers switched to hammers and axes and ladders and the weight of numbers. The written-off held. They held because their blades did not break. They held because Dahyun at the gate was a storm of steel that turned the corridor into a killing ground. They held because Baek's soldiers on the eastern wall fought with weapons that knew their hands. Blades broke. Sihyeon repaired them. Soldiers fell back from the walls with shattered swords, and Yumi ran the pieces to the forge, and Sihyeon welded and reground and sent them back in minutes. He forged through the screaming and the smoke and the shuddering of the walls under ram strikes. Hwando worked beside him, the old SSS rankmaster forging at a speed and focus he had not shown in decades. Side by side, the best and the least, together. At hour 14, Karn's elite guard breached the eastern wall. 400 soldiers with real weapons. The written-off fell back. Baek took a wound to the shoulder and dropped his sword. Sihyeon was already moving. He pulled a blade from the forge. Not a finished blade, a rough shape still glowing orange from the fire. He carried it across the courtyard in his bare hands. The heat seared through his palms, and he did not stop. He reached Baek and pressed the blade into the sergeant's good hand. It was still hot. The grip wrapping smoked, but the edge was hard and the steel was true. And Baek stood and cut down the first elite soldier through the gap, and the line held. The breach closed. Dawn came. Karn's army pulled back. Not defeated, but stopped. Bloodied. Confused. They had expected to roll through a ruin, and instead, they had hit a wall of steel that would not break. At that moment, horns sounded from the northern road. The kingdom's army. Redeployed from the Orda front. The princess's gamble. Pull the northern forces south and pray the Orda did not advance. It worked. 3,000 fresh soldiers hit Karn's flank and the southern duke's army shattered. Not because they were outnumbered, because their weapons were fake and their morale was built on a lie. And when the lie met truth, the lie broke first. Sihyeon stood in the forge. The fire was dying. The last embers pulsed in the basin. His hands were destroyed, burned through the calluses to the raw flesh beneath. He could not close his fingers. He could not hold a hammer. He looked at his hands and thought about his grandfather's hands, and how they had looked after 50 years at the anvil. Old and hard and beautiful. Then something happened. The dying forge flared, not with coal heat, with something else. A light that was gold and warm and ancient. And in the light he heard a voice. Not with his ears, in the iron, in the steel, in every blade he had ever struck, on every anvil in 2 lifetimes. The voice said 2 words. Forge on. He knew that voice. Not because he had heard it before, because every smith who had ever lived had heard it and mistaken it for the ring of the anvil. It was the forge god, the first maker, the forgotten creator of all systems. Alive. Barely. Waking from 3,000 years of silence because a man from another world had been praying without knowing it. Every blade a prayer, every fold a verse, every quench a baptism. Sihyeon knelt on the stone floor of the forge at Seungan with his burned hands open and the golden light washing over him, and he laughed. A small, tired laugh. The laugh of a man who has worked 3 days without sleep and been told there is more to come. He said one thing to the voice in the fire. He said fine. But first, he needed tea. The light flickered, and if a god could smile through flame, then for one moment it did. Outside the walls, the sun rose over a battlefield of broken, fake steel and mud and banners. Dahyun sat against the gate with blood on her armor and her sword across her knees and her eyes closed. Beck was in Liam's medical station with 17 other wounded soldiers and the healer's hands glowing soft white as she moved from one to the next. Yujin stood on the battlements, counting crossbow bolts and planning tomorrow. Emily had fallen asleep standing up against the central tower with her inscribing tools still in her hands. Yumi was in the forge, sweeping ash. Minjun was helping her. Pak was sitting on his stool with his utility knife in his belt, staring at the cold anvil with the expression of a man who has just remembered who he used to be. Hwando was polishing a blade he had forged during the battle. A simple blade, no star metal, no SSS enchantment. 256 layers of scrap steel folded by his own hands in the old way that was the new way. He held it up to the morning light, and for the first time in his life, he saw Damascus and understood what it meant. The princess found Sihyeon in the forge. He was still on his knees. She knelt beside him and took his burned hands in hers very gently and did not say anything. She did not need to. The forge was quiet. The battle was over. The kingdom was still standing, and in a ruined fortress on a hill, surrounded by broken swords and exhausted people, a smith, with no rank and no power and no destiny, except the one he forged with his own hands, had changed the shape of the world. Not with a single legendary blade, with 200 ordinary ones, each one made for a specific hand, each one a letter written in steel, each one a small act of faith that said, I see you, and I remember how you hold your sword, and I made this for you, and no one else. That was the weapon that broke an army. Not magic, not power, not rank, craft. Human hands on hot steel, shaping something that mattered for someone who mattered. The oldest magic in any world. Sihyeon closed his eyes. Rain began to fall on the fortress. It hit the metal, scattered across the courtyard and the battlements and the cold anvils in the forge. 1,000 tiny hammers. The same sound as the night he woke on the scrap heap. The same sound as every night in his workshop in Seoul. The same sound as always. Rain on iron. The lullaby of a smith. He was home.